Did you think Nero played the violin while Rome burned? The violin didn't even exist. That Magellan made the first trip around the world. He died halfway through. That Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake." Those words never left her mouth. Today on LieLab, I'm going to tear down 40 historical lies that were sold to you as truth in school, in documentaries, and in the movies. Subscribe, because we're starting now. Number 1. Nero played the violin while Rome burned the year 64 AD. Rome turned into a bonfire, and up above it all, the Emperor Nero strumming his violin while the city collapsed. The perfect picture of a tyrant. You've seen it in paintings, in movies, and in your school textbooks, and it's pure invention. Let's start with the simplest part. In Nero's day, there was nothing remotely like a violin. Bowed string instruments as we know them showed up more than 1,000 years later. So the most the emperor could pluck was a lyre. Hard to play something nobody had invented yet. And the fire? The historian Tacitus, the most serious source we have, tells us that Nero wasn't even in the city. He was in Antium, about 30 miles away, and he rushed back, opened his gardens to those who had lost everything, and organized the relief effort. The story of the happy musician among the flames was added by Suetonius and Cassius Dio, who wrote decades and even centuries later. Nero was cruel and vain. A violinist in the flames? Never. Number 2. Marco Polo brought pasta from China to Italy. The story sounds airtight. Marco Polo comes back from China in the 13th century, brings home some exotic noodles, and thanks to him, Italian cuisine is born. Without that trip, not a single plate of spaghetti. Sounds perfect, and none of it happened. Pasta was already being eaten in Italy long before Marco Polo was born. The Arab geographer Al-Idrisi wrote that Sicily was making pasta and exporting it across the whole Mediterranean a century and a half before the famous Venetian. There are traces of dried dough shaped into strings going all the way back to the 5th century. And the ones who introduced it were the Arabs, not the Chinese. Where did the tale come from? From a magazine. In 1929, an American Association of Macaroni Makers published a made-up story about a sailor on Marco Polo's ship, named none other than Spaghetti, who found noodles in the East. The fib grew until it sneaked into a movie in 1938. Pure advertising to sell more pasta. Marco Polo brought nothing. An ad from the 30s planted it in your head. Number 3. Einstein failed math. It's the favorite comfort of every lazy student. Relax. Einstein flunked math too. It's a real shame to ruin it, but the line is false, and on top of that, it's backwards. Einstein had mastered calculus by the age of 15. The myth was born from a real exam. At 16, he took the entrance test for the Zurich Polytechnic and didn't pass. But what tripped him up were the humanities subjects, like French, not the sciences. In math and physics, he scored extremely high. To top it off, he sat that exam 2 years younger than the usual age. Sometime later, once he'd become a worldwide celebrity, someone showed him the rumor going around. He denied it flatly and made it clear that he had always been brilliant with numbers. Einstein never failed math. Odds are he knew quite a bit more than the teacher who told you he did. Number 4. Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake." Can you picture a queen looking at her starving people and without batting an eye suggesting they eat cake if there's no bread? It's the line that sealed her reputation as the most heartless woman in France. And she never said it. The line shows up earlier in the writings of Rousseau, who attributed it to an anonymous great princess. Historians point to Maria Theresa, wife of Louis XIV, who lived almost a century earlier. To make things worse, when Rousseau put it in writing, the future queen was a 9-year-old girl who didn't even live in France yet. What there really was propaganda. The revolutionaries needed a monster to justify what was coming, and that line fit perfectly. It worked so well that we keep repeating it 2.5 centuries later, convinced that it's real. She didn't say it. They stitched it onto her mouth to have an excuse before they cut off her head. Number 5. Cleopatra was a dazzlingly beautiful Egyptian. Cleopatra, the most dazzling Egyptian in history, able to bend Julius Caesar and Mark Antony to her will just by showing her face. There are 2 lies stacked into that single sentence. For starters, Cleopatra wasn't Egyptian. She belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek family from Macedonia descended from a general of Alexander the Great. She spoke Greek at court and was one of the very few Ptolemies who bothered to learn the Egyptian language. The second is her legendary beauty, which seems more legend than portrait. The coins minted in her time show her with a prominent nose and strong features far from the ideal of beauty. Plutarch himself wrote that what was irresistible about the queen wasn't her face, but her voice, her wit, and her intelligence in conversation. Cleopatra didn't hypnotize Rome with a pretty profile. She did it with her mind. Number 6. Napoleon was a tiny man. Napoleon Bonaparte, the insecure little man who wanted to dominate Europe to make up for his short stature. The idea sank in so deep that we even named a complex after him. It's a lie, with 2 errors inside it. Napoleon stood close to 5 feet 7 inches, a normal height and even a bit above the French average of his time. The confusion came from the units. The French inch was longer than the English one, so his height, recorded as 5 feet 2 inches in French measure, works out to that modern 5 feet 7, not the height of a dwarf. His enemies pitched in too. British cartoonists drew him tiny to mock him in the middle of the war, and his affectionate nickname, the Little Corporal, came from the love of the troops, not from a tape measure. Napoleon wasn't short. The people who hated him shrank him down by the sheer force of ink. Number 7. The Salem witches died at the stake. Salem, 1692, the most famous witch hunt in history, with women burning tied to a stake while the town watches. That bonfire never existed. In Salem, they burned no one. The trials produced 19 people executed, but all of them on the gallows, on a hill on the outskirts of town. One man, Giles Corey, died crushed under the weight of heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea, and several more of the accused died in jail waiting for sentencing. Stake, not a single one. Burning at the pyre was a custom of continental Europe. In the English world, and therefore in its colonies, those convicted of witchcraft. Number 8. Caligula named his horse Consul, the most deranged emperor of Rome. Caligula supposedly named his horse Incitatus Consul, handing the highest office in the state to an animal. It tends to be cited as the final proof of his madness. The sources say something else. The ancient authors are fairly clear on this. The horse was never consul. Both Suetonius and Cassius Dio only say that Caligula was planning to appoint it, and Dio makes clear that the plan was never carried out. To top it off, both of them wrote decades and even a century after the emperor's death. There's something more. Many historians suspect it wasn't even madness, but a calculated provocation to humiliate the Senate, like shouting at them that a horse would do the job just as well. That said, he did pamper the animal with a marble stable, an ivory manger, and servants of its own. Caligula didn't crown his horse. He used the horse to laugh in the senators' faces. Number 9. An apple fell on Newton's head. Isaac Newton is resting under a tree. An apple drops loose and hits him right on the head. And in that sharp blow, the theory of gravity is born, all in a single flash. Pretty, instant, and pretty false. The anecdote was told by Newton himself, already old, to his friend William Stukeley in 1726. But what he described was something else. He said he saw an apple fall in the garden, and that this led him to wonder why objects always fall toward the center of the earth. At no point did he mention a blow to the head. That picturesque detail was added later, so the story would land better. And gravity wasn't a 1-second lightning bolt. Behind it were years of calculations, doubts, and brutally hard math. The apple, if it fell onto the grass. And the great idea took years, not a moment. Number 10. In Columbus's time, they believed the Earth was flat. Columbus, the lone visionary who dared to set sail while the rest of the world trembled, believing the Earth was flat and that ships would tumble off the edge. Nice scene, and completely false. Anyone with a minimum of education knew the Earth was round all the way back in antiquity. Pythagoras stated it in the 6th century BC, and Eratosthenes even managed to calculate its circumference with remarkable precision. The real debate around Columbus was a different one. The size of the planet. He believed it was much smaller than it is, and that's why he thought that crossing the Atlantic would get him quickly to Asia. The flat Earth tale was manufactured by the writer Washington Irving in a biography of Columbus from 1828, with a scene as dramatic as it was invented, set before a council of scholars. Nobody in that era believed in a flat world. The idea was birthed by a novelist 300 years later. Number 11. Slaves built the Egyptian pyramids. Thousands of chained slaves dragging colossal blocks under the crack of the whip. accurate. It's the image that every movie sold us about the building of the pyramids. It's also false. The pyramids were raised by tens of thousands of Egyptian workers, skilled and paid, not slaves. How do we know? In the 90s, the village of those laborers was dug up, with bakeries, dormitories, and even areas for medical care. And their tombs turned up, placed right next to the king's pyramid, an honor unthinkable for a slave. The bones tell the rest, because they show good nutrition and fractures healed with care. The slave myth was set in motion by the Greek Herodotus, who wrote thousands of years after the work was done, and the movies took care of amplifying it to infinity. There were no chains and no whips. There were workers with wages, hot food, and pride in what they were building. Number 12. Gladiators always fought to the death. We take it for granted that every gladiator fight ended with a corpse sprawled in the sand. Guaranteed blood at every show. The reality was far less generous with death. A gladiator cost a fortune. You had to train him for years, feed him, house him, and heal him when he got hurt. Killing one in every fight was like setting fire to a bag of gold every afternoon. And for the owners, that didn't add up at all. That's why most matchups ended in surrender and not in execution. Gladiators fought only a few times a year. Many survived their entire careers, and some even bought their freedom and became popular idols, like the soccer players of today, with their jerseys and their fans. Of course, people died in the arena, but it was the exception, not the routine. The gladiator didn't walk out to die at every show alive. He was worth far too much to waste. Number 13. Walt Disney is cryogenically frozen. Walt Disney's body floating in a frozen capsule, hidden in some secret basement under Disneyland, waiting for the science of the future to bring him back to life. It's one of the most stubborn rumors of the 20th century, and it's false from end to end. Disney died of lung cancer in December of 1966, and his body was cremated. His ashes rest in Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glendale, California. There's no capsule, there's no ice, and of course there's nothing hidden beneath the Pirates of the Caribbean ride. The rumor sprang up almost immediately after his death, and a coincidence fed it. Shortly after, in 1967, a real human being was frozen for the first time, and people connected the dots on their own. Walt Disney isn't asleep in the cold, waiting to wake up. He ended up, like almost all of us, turned to ashes. Number 14. George Washington had wooden teeth. Every kid is taught that George Washington, the first president of the United States, chewed with a set of wooden teeth. It's one of those facts nobody bothers to question. And it's false. Washington's dentures were made of human teeth, of hippopotamus and cow ivory, and of metal parts, but never of wood. By the time he was sworn into office, the poor man had a single natural tooth left in his whole mouth. So where did the wood come from? The most likely culprit is the ivory. Over the years, it stains and cracks, forming fine grains very much like those of an old plank. Whoever examined those dentures later on swore they were looking at wood, and the mistake stuck forever. Washington's teeth weren't made of oak. They were made of the dead, of animals, and of iron. If you think about it, quite a bit more disturbing. Number 15. Mussolini made the trains run on time. You've surely heard it at some barbecue. Say what you want about Mussolini, but at least he made the trains run on time. The line of the uncle of the day, it's a lie. And on top of that, it's recycled propaganda. A good part of the modernization of the Italian railway was completed before Mussolini took power in 1922, and the passengers of those years kept complaining that the trains ran late. Exactly as always, the idea of perfect punctuality was an image campaign staged by the regime, which foreign tourists later repeated, delighted to find something good to say about the dictator. The slogan ended up outliving the regime itself. And there it still is, floating around dinner tables. Mussolini didn't fix the trains. The only thing he oiled to perfection was the machinery of propaganda. Number 16. Van Gogh cut off his whole ear and sent it to his love. Vincent van Gogh, dragged down by a breakdown, slices off his entire ear in one cut and sends it as a gift to the woman he loves. The story is powerful, but it's only half true. In 1888, in the city of Arles, Van Gogh cut off part of his left ear during a very harsh episode of his illness. Not the whole ear we tend to imagine, but a fragment. And the best documented version tells us that he handed it to a woman who worked in a brothel in the area. not to some great novelistic sweetheart. The whole ear handed to the love of his life is the romantic ornament that the legend kept adding over time because it sounds much more poetic. It wasn't the whole ear, and it wasn't a gesture of desperate love. It was a moment of pain and illness, and a piece of an ear. Number 17. The stiff arm salute was Roman. The arm stretched out front, the palm firm. The martial pose you've seen in every Roman movie. We call it the Roman salute. And it never once occurred to the Romans to salute like that. No ancient text describes that gesture. The salute was actually born more than 1,000 years later in a painting by Jacques-Louis David from 1784 titled The Oath of the Horatii. From the painting, it jumped to the screen in the Italian silent film Cabiria from 1914. Only then did figures like D'Annunzio and Mussolini pick it up and sell it as the glorious inheritance of the empire. In other words, a pose imagined by a French painter, spread by the movies, and then hijacked by dictators who needed an ancient root for their cause. Roman, not at all. The salute everyone believes is classical came out of a canvas. Ancient Rome had nothing to do with it. Number 18. Romans vomited in vomitoriums to keep eating the Roman banquet of your imagination. Senators reclining, eating until they can't take another bite. Getting up, heading to the vomitorium, purging and starting all over. There's a huge problem. The whole misunderstanding fits into one single word. The vomitorium wasn't a little room for bringing up your food, but the exit passage of the amphitheaters. The Colosseum had 80 of them, designed so the crowd could come in and leave within minutes. The name comes from the Latin vomere, which means to expel, because the stadium seemed to spit people out into the street. Nothing to do with dinner. The confusion is fairly modern. It became popular with a novel by Aldous Huxley from 1923, although the idea was already floating around in the 19th century. From there, it passed into the collective imagination as absolute truth. The vomitorium was never used for vomiting. It was, plain and simple, a door. Number 19. Pirates made people walk the plank and buried treasure with maps. Parrot on the shoulder, a map with an X marking the treasure, chests buried in the sand, and prisoners forced to walk the plank out toward the sea. The pirate in your head is perfect. It's also almost entirely invention. That picture was carved by literature, especially the novel Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson from 1883, and later Peter Pan reinforced it. Real pirates almost never buried their loot because they preferred to spend it fast on dry land between taverns and pleasures. Of hidden treasures, there's barely one well-documented case, that of Captain Kidd. And the business of walking the plank practically doesn't appear in the records of the era. The buccaneer with the parrot and the treasure map never sailed the Caribbean. He did set sail, though, from the pages of an adventure novel. Number 20. The chastity belt is medieval. The knight heads off to the Crusades, and before mounting up, fastens an iron chastity belt with a padlock onto his wife to guarantee her fidelity. The scene is juicy. Historical, not so much. There's almost no evidence that medieval knights used any such device. The vast majority of the supposed medieval belts displayed in museums are forgeries made in the 18th and 19th centuries, or pieces made as a simple joke. The first known mention appears in a satirical drawing, probably meant as a gag. It was the Victorian era that fantasized about a barbaric and brutal Middle Ages and projected onto the past an object that never worked the way we imagine it. Morbid curiosity did the rest. No chastity belt ever locked up a medieval lady. The only thing it locked up was the feverish imagination of the centuries that came afterward. Number 21. Spartacus fought to abolish slavery. Spartacus, the heroic gladiator who took up arms to free all the slaves of Rome and wipe slavery off the face of the earth. The great liberator of antiquity. That motivation is a late addition. There's no evidence at all that Spartacus was trying to abolish slavery. What he wanted was to escape. He and about 70 gladiators broke out of the school in Capua in the year 73 BC with a very concrete goal: to win back their freedom and return to their homelands. Not to topple the entire system. The ancient sources agree that the original plan was, quite simply, to flee. The figure of the revolutionary Spartacus was built much later by novels, by the writings of Karl Marx, and above all by the movie from 1960. He did free slaves, it's true, but to add soldiers to his army, not as a moral crusade. Spartacus wasn't fighting against slavery in the abstract. He was fighting against his own, which is a very different thing. Number 22. Medieval people died at 30. You've been told 1,000 times. In the Middle Ages, no one made it past 30, and by 25, you were already an old man. It sounds logical, but it hides a mathematical trap. The average lifespan collapsed because of infant mortality. So many babies and small children died that the average plummeted. But the number didn't mean adults dropped dead the moment they turned 30. If you managed to survive childhood, you had real chances of reaching 50, 60, or more. In fact, there were plenty of medieval people who crossed 70 and 80. Kings, monks, peasants, and merchants grew old completely normally and died surrounded by grandchildren. Nobody had an expiration date at 30. The hard part was getting through the first few years. After that, a long life lay ahead of you. Number 23. Henry VIII beheaded all his wives. Henry VIII of England, the butcher king who ordered the head cut off of each and every one of his wives. Quite a reputation, and quite exaggerated. He had 6 wives, yes, but only 2 ended up on the scaffold. Anne Boleyn in 1536 and Catherine Howard in 1542. And the other 4. Catherine of Aragon had her marriage annulled and died of natural causes. Anne of Cleves had hers annulled too, and lived perfectly peacefully for years. Jane Seymour passed away shortly after giving birth. And Catherine Parr had the last word because she outlived the king himself. The English memorize it with a cruel rhyme. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Henry VIII didn't behead them all. Out of 6 wives, 2 lost their heads. It's still an appalling record for a husband, but not the one the legend tells. Number 24. The Aztecs believed Cortez was the god, Quetzalcoatl. Moctezuma watches Cortez arrive, mistakes him for the god Quetzalcoatl, returning according to an old prophecy, and frozen with reverence, hands over his empire without firing a single arrow. It's an impeccable tale, and it's for the most part a later fabrication. There's no solid evidence that the Mexica believed the Spaniards were gods, nor that before the conquest there circulated a prophecy about Quetzalcoatl returning from the east. That version was put in writing for the first time in 1552, more than 30 years later, by the Spaniard Lopez de Gomara, who never set foot in America. Who did the tale serve? Everyone who needed to explain it. Cortez dressed up Moctezuma's speech to legitimize the plunder, and then the defeated indigenous elites adopted it so they wouldn't have to admit they fell by force of arms. Cortez wasn't taken for a god. He was promoted to god afterward, to dress up a robbery. Number 25. Thumbs down meant kill him. In your head, the scene is crisp. The emperor in his box, the thumb going down, and the defeated gladiator takes the final blow. Thumb up, he lives. The truth is, we don't even know which gesture ordered death. Roman texts mention a pollis verso, a turned thumb, but at no point do they make clear which way it pointed. There are historians who argue the opposite of what you imagine, that showing the thumb like a drawn sword meant finishing off the loser, and hiding it inside the fist meant mercy. The image of the thumb pointing down was fixed by a painting, the Pollis Verso by Jean-Léon Gérôme, painted in 1872. From that canvas, the movies copied it and turned it into universal truth. The thumb that condemns was invented by a 19th century painter. Rome never left the instructions in writing. Number 26. Houston, we have a problem. Houston, we have a problem. The most famous line of the space race, supposedly said word for word by the crew of Apollo 13 in the middle of an emergency. The catch is that nobody said it that way. In April of 1970, when an oxygen tank exploded on the way to the moon, the astronaut Jack Swigert told ground control with these words, "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem." In the past tense. Control asked him to repeat it, and Commander Jim Lovell confirmed with the same wording, once again in the past, not the present. The version we all know, shorter and more urgent, was carved by the 1995 movie starring Tom Hanks. To make matters worse, the film credited it to Lovell, when the first one to say it had been Swigert. Nobody said we have a problem, they said we had. The verb tense that gives you goosebumps was added by Hollywood, not NASA. Number 27. Galileo dropped balls from the Tower of Pisa. Galileo climbs to the top of the Tower of Pisa, drops 2 balls of different weights, and proves, before an amazed crowd, that they fall at the same time. A great textbook scene. That probably never happened. The only source for that story is the biography written by his disciple Vincenzo Viviani in 1654, published only in 1717, many years after the scholar's death. Most historians believe it was a thought experiment, an idea tested out in his head, and not a real demonstration from the tower. On top of that, something very similar had already truly been done by the mathematician Simon Stevin in Holland in 1586. Quite a bit before Galileo, the theatrical scene at the tower was decorated by the biographers as the years went by. Galileo was completely right about falling bodies. The tower, on the other hand, is pure script. Number 28. Pythagoras discovered the Pythagorean theorem, the famous AI squared plus B squared equals C squared, discovered by the Greek Pythagoras. It even bears his name, but the theorem isn't his, not even close. The Babylonians already knew the triples of numbers that satisfy that relationship, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras came into the world. There's a clay tablet, known as Plimpton 322, dated to around the year 1800 BC, packed full of those values. And they weren't the only ones, because the concept was also handled in India and in China. To cap it off, there isn't even firm proof that Pythagoras himself proved the theorem. That attribution comes from Greek writers who lived long after him and who tended to magnify his figure. The most famous theorem in school wasn't born with Pythagoras. It was written down by some anonymous Babylonians who beat him to it by a good 1,000 years. Number 29. The Curse of Tutankhamun killed those who opened the tomb. They opened the sealed tomb of the young pharaoh and, one after another, a 1,000-year-old curse starts taking down everyone who dared to go in. It sounds like a horror movie, and it works like one, because it's fiction. The tomb was opened by Howard Carter in 1922. His patron, Lord Carnarvon, died in 1923, but from nothing supernatural. He was killed by a mosquito bite that got infected and turned into septicemia. The newspapers of the time invented the curse because it sold an enormous number of copies. Carter himself, who was the most exposed man of the entire expedition, lived 17 more years without incident. And a medical study published in 2002 compared the longevity of the people present at the opening and found that they lived exactly as long as anyone else. There was no pharaoh's curse. There was a well-timed mosquito and a newsroom with a strong appetite for a big headline. Number 30. Edison invented the light bulb. Thomas Edison, the genius who lit up the world by inventing the light bulb. That's the schoolbook version. The real one is that he improved it, but he didn't invent it. Electric light already existed long before him. Humphrey Davy had lit an arc lamp back around 1809. And above all, the Englishman Joseph Swan showed an incandescent bulb working around 1878 and 1879, and even patented his own in Great Britain before anyone else. What Edison did achieve was coming up with a practical, cheap, and durable version in 1879, and even more importantly, setting up the entire electrical system to sell it and distribute it on a large scale. The proof that Swan got there first is overwhelming, because they ended up partnering in a company christened Ediswan. Edison didn't light the first bulb. He made it profitable, industrialized it, and, along the way, kept all the glory for himself. Number 31. Dr. Guillotin invented the guillotine. The most famous killing machine in history carries the name of its supposed inventor, Dr. Guillotin. Too bad he invented nothing, and that on top of it all, he was against the death penalty. In 1789, Guillotin only proposed a faster and more egalitarian method of execution, the same one for nobles and commoners. The prototype was designed by another physician, the surgeon Antoine Louis, and the construction was left in the hands of a German harpsichord maker, Tobias Schmidt. At first, the device was called the Louisette, in honor of Louis, and it wasn't even a new idea, because similar contraptions had already been working centuries earlier, like the English Halifax gibbet and the Scottish maiden. Guillotin hated that his surname stayed tied to that blade. His family even tried to detach itself from the name, without much luck. Guillotin didn't invent the guillotine. He only had the terrible misfortune of lending it, without meaning to, his surname. Number 32. In the Middle Ages, nobody bathed. They sold us 1,000 years of filthy, lice-ridden, foul-smelling people who never went near water. The famous dirty Middle Ages. Another enormous exaggeration. In medieval cities, there were public bathhouses everywhere. Some towns had dozens or even hundreds of them, and taking a bath was a social activity and a respected one. People washed their face and hands daily, soap existed, and everyone looked after their hygiene according to what their wallet allowed. The paradoxical part is that those public baths began to close right after the Middle Ages, between the 16th and 17th centuries, out of fear of catching plagues and because of a new wave of moralism. In other words, in the height of the medieval period, people washed more than they did in the centuries that followed. The lice-ridden peasant is a myth. The one who stopped bathing came along quite a bit later. Number 33. The Viking funeral was a burning ship pushed out to sea. The Viking warrior lies on his ship, they push it out to sea, and a flaming arrow sets the vessel alight, and it drifts away in flames toward the horizon while the clan weeps on the shore, an unforgettable image, and almost entirely manufactured by the movies. Archaeology tells another story. The great ship burials, like the ones found at Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway, were vessels dragged onto dry land and used as a burial chamber, then covered with a mound of earth. They weren't set on fire, and they weren't released into the water because a ship was an asset far too valuable to waste that way. When there was cremation, it happened on land. The picture of the ship burning adrift comes from the sagas, like the funeral of the god Balder, and from movies like The 13th Warrior. The Viking didn't set off wrapped in fire toward the sunset. They buried him under a mound, ship and all. Number 34. The Library of Alexandria burned in a single night. A single fateful night. A massive fire, and within hours, all the accumulated wisdom of humanity reduced to ashes. That's how they told us about the end of the Library of Alexandria. The reality is far less cinematic. The library didn't die in one night, nor from a single cause. It faded out over the course of several centuries through successive blows. There was a partial fire in the time of Julius Caesar, budget cuts that gradually emptied it, expulsions of scholars and learned men, and various political conflicts that wore it down little by little. There never was that apocalyptic blaze that swallowed millions of scrolls in one go. What there was a slow, gray, bureaucratic decline, far less marketable than the legend of the Great Fire. The Great Library didn't burn in one heroic night. It died off bit by bit, out of pure neglect, over entire centuries. Number 35. Lady Godiva rode naked through the city. Lady Godiva rides forward, naked on her horse, crossing the streets of Coventry to protest the abusive taxes of her own husband. A famous scene that almost certainly never happened. Lady Godiva really existed. She was a noblewoman of the 11th century. The problem is that the famous clothesless horseback ride appears for the first time in the Chronicles some 200 years after her death, well into the 13th century. No document from her own time mentions any such ride. And the character of the Peeper, that peeping Tom who spies on her in secret and is struck blind as punishment, was added to the tale even later, in the 17th century. It's layers upon layers of ornament piled onto a real woman who probably never took off her clothes for any of this. Lady Godiva was flesh and blood. Her naked ride, on the other hand, is an embroidery of later centuries. Number 36. The 1938 War of the Worlds caused a mass panic. The year 1938. Orson Welles narrates a Martian invasion on the radio, and, according to legend, the entire United States bursts into panic, with crowds fleeing their homes and streets collapsing under hysteria. The stampede never happened that way. The broadcast, in reality, was heard by only about 2% of the population. The supposed mass panic was inflated by the newspapers the next day, largely to hit the radio, which was stealing their advertising. A book published in 1940 stretched the figures even further and fixed the myth forever. Of course, there were people who got scared, that's real. But the image of an entire country running in terror is an invention of the headlines, not a proven fact. The Martian panic wasn't caused by Wells at the microphone. It was manufactured in ink by the next morning's newspapers. Number 37. The feudal lord had a right to the wedding night. The right of the first night, that supposed feudal law that allowed the lord to spend the first night with the bride of any peasant, even before the husband himself. You saw it in Braveheart. In reality, it never existed. There isn't a single serious record of any such rule. Historians combed through manuscripts, legal codes, letters, rulings, and trial records from all over the Middle Ages, and the famous right doesn't show up anywhere. The term Lord of the Bed was coined by the philosopher Voltaire, and the idea became famous thanks to a play by Beaumarchais and to the opera The Marriage of Figaro by Mozart, which premiered in 1786. The historian Alain Bourreau, who devoted an entire book to the matter, was emphatic. The right of the first night was never law. It was a fantasy recycled as a political weapon against the old order. No feudal lord ever had that privilege in writing. He only had it in the scripts. Number 38. Dracula is based on Vlad the Impaler. Bram Stoker's Count Dracula, that creature inspired, as everyone repeats, by Vlad the Impaler, the Romanian prince who skewered his enemies on stakes. The connection seems obvious, and it's for the most part a modern legend. The only thing Stoker really took from Vlad was the name. In his research notes, he copied from a book that Dracula, in the Wallachian language, meant devil, and nothing more than that. He doesn't mention any Vlad, nor the nickname the Impaler, nor a single one of his atrocities. In fact, in the first drafts of the novel, his villain was named Count Wampir. The association between Dracula and Vlad was popularized by a book from 1972. A great deal later. The only thing the character and the real prince share is that both fought against the Turks. Stoker built the vampire out of Eastern European folklore. Dracula isn't Vlad the Impaler. Stoker only stole from him a name that sounded like hell. Number 39. Magellan made the first trip around the world. Ferdinand Magellan, the first man to go all the way around the planet. The books repeat it, the statues shout it, and even a strait carries his surname. The uncomfortable detail is that he never finished that voyage. Magellan died on April 27th, 1521 in the Battle of Mactan in the Philippines, run through by enemy spears. He hadn't even passed the halfway point of the route. The one who truly closed the circle was his second in command, Juan Sebastian Elcano, who took the helm of the ship Victoria and returned to Spain in September of 1522. And the toll of the voyage gives you chills. Out of the nearly 270 men who set sail, only 18 came back alive. The captain who gives the feat its name wasn't among them. The first to circle the earth had the surname Elcano. We hung the medal on Magellan for half the job. Number 40. Napoleon blew off the Sphinx's nose with a cannon. Napoleon's soldiers, bored in the desert, used the majestic Sphinx of Giza as target practice and blow off its nose with a well-aimed cannon shot. A good anecdote for the troops. Too bad it's impossible. The Danish explorer Frederick Louis Norden had already drawn the Sphinx with no nose in 1737, more than 60 years before Napoleon set foot in Egypt in 1798. Hard to break something if you haven't even been born yet. The real culprit shows up in another chronicle. The Arab historian al-Makrizi tells us that in 1378, a religious fanatic named Muhammad Saim al-Dar smashed the nose to pieces with chisel blows, furious because the local peasants were making offerings to the statue as if it were an idol. The marks left in the stone confirm the detail, because they're chisel strikes and not the impact of a cannonball. Napoleon didn't denose the Sphinx. A fanatic mutilated it with a chisel 4 centuries before he was born. 40 lies dismantled, one by one. If you like having your certainties ruined, subscribe to LieLab.